Hello! In this video we're going to run through creating your own custom opsdroid skill from scratch. So hopefully this will be kind of where opsdroid becomes useful to you, in that you can write your own custom functionality so that you can talk to your bot in whatever way you like and add different features to it. So I've started out here just with the terminal open and opsdroid desktop. We're going to use opsdroid desktop for actually talking to our skill and testing it out, and we're going to create it over here in the terminal. So skills in opsdroid are just Python modules. They're Python modules that import some decorators from opsdroid and consist of a load of functions that are decorated up in a specific way. So we'll get onto that in a minute. But the first thing we need is a place for this module to live. We need to create a module that Python will know how to import. So there's two different ways of doing this in Python. You can either have a file, just a simple Python file, and you can point to it in the opsdroid configuration, or you can create a Python module directory, which is a directory that contains a file called __init__.py, and you can be a bit more flexible with that. You can add different things like dependencies and stuff. So we're going to start on this second one and just create a straightforward module directory. So first off, we want somewhere for this to live on our system. This can be absolutely anywhere that opsdroid can read from, but I'm just going to create a directory in my home directory called skills. And inside this directory, I am going to create our module directory. So skills / my first skill. And then in that directory, I'm just going to touch this init file that I said about, so __init__.py. So this is the Python file that opsdroid will load, and this is where we want to put all of our functionality. Touching this file on Linux just creates an empty text file. So what we also need to do is we need to tell opsdroid about this skill. So let's have a look in our configuration file again. So .opsdroid configuration. We'll scroll down to the skills section, and in here we're just going to create our skill. So my first skill. Now, as I said in the last video, if I just left this as it is, opsdroid would not know where to find the skill, so it would automatically go away to GitHub and try to find a project called opsdroid /skill - my first skill. But we don't want it to do that. We want it to look for the skill directory that we've just created. So we're going to tell it where that is. Now, there's two different options here. We can either give it a path to that directory, or we could go into that directory and turn it into a Git repository and commit our code, and then you can point opsdroid at that Git repository. So that helps if you want to do versioning, or you want to be a bit more controlled about how you are managing your skill. But for now, we're just going to use the path option, and we're going to say this skill lives in my home directory in a skills directory, and it's called my first skill. So now when opsdroid starts, what it will do is it will, when it gets to loading that skill, it will go, it's at that path, so I'm going to go away and I'm going to take a copy of that skill and put it into the opsdroid modules directory. So this is great because it then caches that skill, and the next time we run opsdroid, it doesn't have to go and do the installation again. This is really useful if your skills are going to be pulling in loads of dependencies or other Python packages, or if you've got lots of skills. This will speed up the launch of opsdroid. However, when we're developing it, we want to be able to make little changes to the skill and then restart opsdroid for those to take effect. And if it's cached that in the modules directory, then we're not going to see those changes. So we can also add an option called no cache and set that to true. Now, you only ever really want to do this when you're developing a skill. The rest of the time you want to let it do its caching. So that's enough now for opsdroid to know where to go and grab that to install, and to know to reinstall it every time. So let's just save out of this file, and we can now get started actually writing our skill. So what I will do is I will edit this skill. So let's open it in nano skill / my first skill / __init.py. So this is just a basic empty Python file, and we're going to start writing our skill in here. So the main body of a skill is a function or a set of functions, and each function is decorated with the the matcher that opsdroid will use when parsing the messages. So let's start out with a very simple regular expression example. So we need to from opsdroid.matches import match regex. Okay, so we're going to use the regular expression matcher here. If you're not familiar with regular expressions, it's just a syntax for matching a string against another string. But those strings can be kind of a bit more optional or variable. You'll see it kind of working in a second. So once we've got this matcher, this matcher is a decorator. So we're going to decorate our function with the matcher, and opsdroid knows then to load that into the skills when it imports this module. So we're going to start with the decorator, match regex, and then in brackets you give it the regular expression that you want. Now regular expressions work better if you do it as a raw string, so let's start with an empty raw string. It's just a string with an R at the beginning. We've already got the hello world skill loaded, so let's start with a how are you skill. Okay, now in regular expressions, lots of symbols have different meanings. Question mark does have a meaning, so we're just going to use a backslash to tell it that is actually a question mark. Now we're actually going to write the function that is going to be called when we run opsdroid. So opsdroid uses some fairly new features in Python 3.5, mainly a library called async.io, which allows you to do concurrent programming in Python. It's really nice. It allows Python to act in a really responsive way. So normally when you run Python, it runs every single line sequentially. And if you want to do more than one thing at a time, you have to do threads and thread management and all sorts of funky stuff. Whereas in Python 3.5, you can use this thing called async.io, which allows you to write code that takes it in turns to execute. And that's really nice if you think about something that's event-driven, like a chatbot. You might have lots of people talking to the bot at the same time, and you want the bot to respond to them all roughly at the same time, rather than having to wait for one person, you know, have a conversation with one person and then switch and have a conversation with another person. So you don't need to worry about that too much, other than the fact that we have to use some of the new functionality in async.io and Python 3.5 to define our function. So to create one of these asynchronous functions, we start with, instead of the word def immediately, we start with async def. Okay, and now we can define our function name. It doesn't really matter what you call your function in this context. It's just kind of for your own reference, because you're never actually going to call a function by its name, because the decorator is doing the clever work of telling opsdroid when to actually call that function. So let's just call this the how are you function. Now, all opsdroid skills need to be able to take 3 arguments. So they are the opsdroid object itself. So when opsdroid is running, there is an object which is opsdroid, and it has all sorts of different information about the whole running system, which you can use within your skill if you want to. We'll get on to some examples of probably using that in a little while. You also need a configuration option. So this is any of the key value pairs that have been specified in the configuration for your skill. So if you've got your name and my first skill, but you could add another option of my API key for some service you want to call, and this config object is where all of those values will end up to be used in your skill. And then the last thing is a message. So the message object is an opsdroid object which contains the text that's come from the user, which user sent the message, which room that message was said in, whether it was in the direct message room, or if it was in something like Slack, you might have #general or #random or another room like that. And then there's also the connector which the message was sent through. So you might, in opsdroid, have more than one connector set up. You might have Facebook Messenger and Twitter direct message set up. So when a Facebook Messenger user speaks to opsdroid, it wants to respond through Facebook Messenger. And when a Twitter direct message user speaks, you want it to go back through Twitter direct message. So it stores that as an option within the message. But this is just our first basic skill. So we are going to literally just respond straight back to that message, how are you, with I'm fine, thanks. So as I said, we need to use some of the new Python 3.5 stuff. So we have to await this function being called. This we're gonna call message.respond, which just says respond to the message with this string. But we have to await that function so that it runs in sequence with the async IO stuff. So we're just going to respond and say, I'm fine, thanks. And that's it. This is a very basic skill. It's just going to check every message that comes into opsdroid to see if the message is, how are you? And if it is, it's going to call our function, and our function is just going to respond and say, I'm fine, thanks. So let's save this, and we're going to start opsdroid. So we've got the opsdroid shell connector started up. I'm actually just going to quit out of this again, and I'm going to have a look in the configuration and just turn the console logging back on so that we can see the log message coming out into the console. So let's change that to true, and I'm also just going to get rid of the shell connector because we're using opsdroid desktop. We don't really need the shell connector to be enabled. So save that, and we're going to run opsdroid again. Excellent. So opsdroid has started up. It's just showing the very basic info messages about the application starting and the web server starting. But now if we come over to opsdroid desktop and click on the little connection bubble and click connect, we can see over here we've had a couple of requests come through from opsdroid desktop connecting to the WebSocket, and it says connected over here. So we can say hi to opsdroid, and this will call the hi skill, the hello world skill that we have configured by default. But I should now be able to say how are you? And opsdroid comes back and says I'm fine, thanks. So this is just called the skill that we've written. It's matched against how are you? And it's come back to say I'm fine, thanks. So this is the really, really basic, the most basic level of opsdroid skill that you can write. Now, we don't necessarily want it to match against how are you exactly, because if I say something like how are you without the question mark, it completely ignores me. Or how's it going? Completely ignores me. What's up? Because it's trying to match specifically against that regular expression of how are you. So what we're going to do is we're just going to stop opsdroid, and we're going to go back into the skill and make that regular expression a little bit more flexible and a little bit easier to handle. So let's edit our skill again. And in the regular expression, we are going to, first of all, we're going to make this question mark optional. So this is why I escaped that question mark before, because what question mark actually means in a regular expression is the character before this or the group before this is optional. So we've got how are you with an actual question mark that's been escaped, and then a question mark to say that's optional. But what we could also do is we could put this whole thing in a group like this, and then add an or statement. So we've got how are you with an optional question mark, or we could have how's it going, also with an optional question mark. Or we could have what's up with an optional question mark. So now we've got three different ways of saying that same sentence with or without a question mark. And we can then save this. And if we run opsdroid again, it will reinstall this module because we've told it not to cache. We go opsdroid desktop to connect again. So now we should be able to say how are you with a question mark, exactly like we said before. And it comes back saying I'm fine, thanks. But I should be able to say how are you without the question mark. Still says I'm fine, thanks. How's it going? So you can see it's coming back over and over, matching against all these different variations on how are you. As I'm sure you can start to see, this can get a little bit tedious when you're trying to write all the different variations of all the different ways somebody could say something. So this is where the API AI parser really comes into its own, because there's a lot more intelligence going on in their API service for actually matching these sentences together. But we'll probably come on to that in a later video, so we'll stick with the regular expression parser for now. Now, let's just stop opsdroid again, and we're going to go back into the skill. Now, it's a little bit boring that it's always responding with exactly I'm fine, thanks, So what we're going to do is we're going to add a little bit of variation to the messages that come back. So what we do is we're going to create a list of different options, and then when it responds, we're going to get it to randomly choose from that list. So let's create a variable called responses, and that variable is equal to a list, and we'll close off that list down here. So this first option will be I'm fine, thanks, exactly as we had before, but we could also have I'm doing good, or I'm good, thank you. So we could have all these different ways of saying this same response. Now we want to randomly choose one of these, so what we want to do further up is we want to import the Python random module, and then when we respond, instead of responding with this string, we want to respond with a random choice from the responses list. Responses. Okay, so this will take a random choice of one of these elements in the list and then send that back through the response. So we'll save this and run opsdroid again. And if we come back over to Messenger, over to the desktop, and say, how's it going? It says, I'm good, thank you. And say, how's it going? It now says, I'm doing good, how are you? So you can see it's kind of coming back with a few different random responses from that list. There we go, I think we've had all three now. So this is just a way of making your bot feel a little bit more natural and a little bit more, a little bit more human, rather than it just coming back with exactly the same message over and over. You've got this variation and this spread. So I think we're going to end this here and just say you kind of seen how to build a very basic skill, a very basic module. You can, of course, put all sorts of different bits and pieces into that function, so you can call out to web services and all sorts of things to get data and information, and then respond back to the user. And also, matching against a regular expression is only one of the ways that we can match. So we'll come on to all sorts of different kind of skills and things in later videos.